rule is very difficult. There's no form of government that is immune to the risk of being overthrown. Monarchies are overthrown, tyrannies are overthrown, oligarchies are overthrown, and alas, democracies are overthrown. And that's a huge political problem. It reminds me of the young man who goes off to defend his country against an expected attack by a powerful empire. Not only does defeat the Assyrian Empire, but goes on to destroy that empire, liberate the subject people, while adding to his own power and his own alliance. So toward the end of the book, at the end of book 7 out of the 8, Cyrus is in a position to rule the world.
Well, it's great to have you here, Wayne.
It's a pleasure to be here. This is very exciting for me.
Yeah, it's a great honor for me. I had read your introduction and translation of Xenophon's The Education of Cyrus about a year ago. And I mean, it profoundly impacted me. I feel like the rarely do you read an introduction to a kind of a classic work, and the introduction stands out as, you know, almost being on par with the text itself.
No, certainly not. But there's
a way in which I think Harvey Mansfield's introduction to Machiavelli's The Prince kind of is a similar one that is pretty formative for me. So today I want to talk about Xenophon, and in particular his portrait of Cyrus the Great, and the lessons that we can glean for both political theory but also political leadership today. But, you know, when I say, when I go out and I'm talking about kind of great leaders and I mention the name Xenophon or Cyrus, you know, eyes almost glaze over. You know, no one knows, unfortunately, who Xenophon is today. So who was this Greek philosopher and warrior?
Yeah. Well, I'm disappointed to hear that eyes glaze over at his name, because he's a wonderful character and a fascinating human being. But he was obviously an ancient Greek, came to his maturity approximately at the divide between the 5th and 4th centuries BC. And I think his life can be divided, roughly speaking, into 3 main categories or 3 main parts. The first part is when he was a student of Socrates. I hope eyes don't glaze over at the name Socrates, one of the greatest political philosophers ever to have lived. And Xenophon passed several years in Socrates' company. And then, for complicated reasons, Xenophon left Socrates shortly before Socrates' death, which was 399 BC, when Socrates was put to death by the Athenians.
What were the complicated reasons?
Well, if they were simple, I could tell you easily. But I'm not sure whether the reasons for Xenophon's departure from being with Socrates didn't have to do with the complicated situation that Athens was in at the time. They had just lost in 404 BC a 27-year-long war with Sparta. And at the end of that were a series of revolutions that complicated Athenian politics. And Socrates' students or followers were often on the wrong side of these revolutions. And so they fell into into a bad odor, let's say. And I think Xenophon's situation in Athens, he doesn't say, so I can't say for sure, may have been complicated owing to the revolutions that had occurred in Athens and the suspicions aroused against followers of Socrates that were thought to be insufficiently democratic. So that's my premise, is that this had much to do with Xenophon's departure. It may also have been that he saw an opportunity, and the reason what he did when he left Socrates shortly before Socrates' death, which also shows the problems in Athens for Socrates and his followers, is that he signed up with 10,000 other Greek mercenaries to go on an expedition organized by a man named Cyrus. This happens not to be the Cyrus who is the Cyrus of the education of Cyrus. That's Cyrus the Great.
But there actually was in the 10,000, right? They were in service to an actual man named Cyrus?
An actual man named Cyrus. This is much more historical than the education of Cyrus, in my understanding. And Xenophon explains all of this in the book called The Anabasis of Cyrus, in which Xenophon himself is a leading character. But this second phase of Xenophon's life is an extraordinarily rich political experience in which Xenophon finds himself the leader, or a co-leader, but the most important co-leader of a group of 10,000 Greek mercenaries. So we can go into that story if you'd like, but just for simplicity, you asked who was the Xenophon? He's a man who combines period 1, study with Socrates, period 2, intense political activity that extends even beyond the Anabasis when he fights side by side with a Spartan king named Agesilaus. And then the third period, 25 years approximately, when he retires to an estate and thinks and writes. So he has, you could say, philosophic activity going on when he's with Socrates, when he writes at the end, sandwiched around a brilliant military career and extensive political activity. So he should be on the lips of everyone who cares at all about political philosophy. What other political philosopher can you think of that led 10,000
It was actually
10,000 soldiers?
A general, a soldier, and also a statesman and a philosopher.
I mean, Kant never did that. You can't imagine. Or Hobbes.
Yeah.
Maybe.
I wish some of our politicians today actually had that experience of serving in the armed forces and also the life of the mind. So let's start maybe with talking a little bit more about Socrates and the school of thought, and then I do want to move to his Xenophon's military accomplishments. You mentioned that Socrates was thought to be insufficiently democratic, and another kind of scholar who I've been reading his history of the West is Frank Oakley, who was at Williams College, and he was writing about Aristotle and Socrates and Plato, and his claim is actually that they had more in common with the world that preceded them for the previous 5,000 years that preceded them than what has come after them or what we have in the West today. And I think what he was really getting at is that their mindset was far more aristocratic, right? That their understanding of who could become perhaps a philosopher, who could be a truly free human being, that for them was actually very limited to a few very excellent, individuals, that it wasn't, necessarily a kind of the democratic vision that we might perhaps at times read back into them today. So I'm curious, what are these criticisms about Socrates being insufficiently democratic?
Well, perhaps I misspoke. I meant to say his students were suspected of being insufficiently democratic. Now, Socrates was put on trial and convicted by the Athenians on the grounds that he corrupted the youth and that he did not believe in the gods of the city, but introduced other new divinities. So neither of those charges is explicitly a charge that he was insufficiently democratic. But some of his followers did participate in the revolutions that occurred at the end of the Peloponnesian War and were on the anti-democratic side. One thing that I think is very interesting in Xenophon's writings, as I should have said previously, are divided between Socratic writings especially, and then political writings and political history. In the Socratic writings, it's very interesting if you try to pin down why Socrates was put to death by the Athenians. It's striking that the Apology of Socrates is one of the most, by Plato, is one of the main sources. But that begins with Socrates' defense. It doesn't state what the prosecution said. The opening words of the Apology of Socrates by Plato are, I don't know about you, O men of Athens, but I myself have almost forgotten who I was, so persuasively did my accusers speak. So he claims the accuser spoke very persuasively, but he doesn't identify directly what they say. Xenophon in the Memorabilia, and this is a reason Xenophon should be on everyone's lips, another reason, he actually introduces 7 different arguments that he attributes to the accuser of Socrates in Book 1, Chapter 2 of the Memorabilia. And one of these is a Socrates mocking democracy on the grounds that it depends upon chance, because Athenian democracy often had people chosen by office by just the throwing of rolling of the dice,
interesting,
that sort of thing, which it makes a certain amount of sense because you're going to get ordinary people that way.
This is kind of William F. Buckley Jr.'s point about he'd rather be governed by the first 10,000 people in the Boston phone book.
Exactly, rather than the Yale faculty.
Yeah.
Right. And so that is an argument which Xenophon attributes to Socrates, that you would never choose a doctor on this basis or a general on this basis, but you let the Athenian people rule on this basis. So I suspect that some of the anti-democratic sentiments of his students are traceable to some views that Socrates occasionally considered along with them. But I don't know that Socrates ever participated, for example, in anti-democratic politics. But he did, I gather from Xenophon, he didn't see that democracy would solve all problems of government and that more of it was always going to be better. I don't know about his attachment to the aristocratic class. It is true that a number of his followers came from the aristocracy. Of course, Alcibiades would be the most striking example. I'm really not sure whether that was a principle of his, that the aristocratic class would be a better source for philosophical types than not. I just don't know. That he would be eager to find a natural Aristoi. That's easy for me to say.
Sure.
But of course. But do you necessarily find the natural Aristoi more closely associated with the actual political aristocracy or not? On that, I hesitate to say.
Yeah,
I just don't know.
So then Xenophon, so how does he go from studying under Socrates so he joins the mercenary army?
Yes.
So he must be, physically kind of fit and have political aspirations that he saw that he could attain those through serving in a military capacity.
I think that's possible. That's why I say it's a complicated question. It seems like he was leaving something, a complicated political situation in Athens, and where the complications even led to Socrates' execution, a very dramatic and sad moment. So I think that's a measure of how vigorously the pot was boiling in Athens. But as you just imply, I presume he also had some positive reasons for going on this, and that may have been to develop some political gifts. It is very interesting in his book, The Anabasis, when he describes how he gets involved in a leadership position. He had not previously sought one in this army. He was a nobody. He was a private soldier. And it just happens that their reason for being where they were was because they didn't know this when they signed up, or at least most didn't, is because the younger Cyrus had aspirations to overthrow his older brother, who was the ruler of Persia, a ruler named Artaxerxes. And in a battle between the two brothers, with the Greek mercenaries participating, Cyrus gets himself killed. So suddenly you've got 10,000 Greeks in the middle of Persia near Babylon, fully surrounded by Persian troops with no leader. Then to compound the matters, the Persians very nicely say, well, let's talk things over. We can negotiate a settlement. We don't want to fight you. The Persians orchestrated this, offer of a treaty to solve the problem, and then took advantage of the situation and slaughtered them. So now the Greek mercenaries are stuck near Babylon, and they have no leadership at all. And then Xenophon presents himself as having this thought: either I get down there and show these guys that there is a way out, or at least try, or we just get slaughtered.
And he's just a private at the time.
He's a private. He's a nobody. And so he, in the morning, it's a very beautiful passage, actually. He puts on his most beautiful military gear, and stands up and gives this speech to the Greeks. And his stature rises like crazy, and he gives them concrete measures. We need to do A, B, C, D. And they say, he's right. So it doesn't solve his leadership problems because he's an Athenian and most of the Greeks are Spartan. And so he's viewed with a certain degree of suspicion, and that endures for a while. But it's a dramatic change of events, and it gives him this experience of ruling and of trying to design tactics that will enable them to fight their way out of this terrible situation that they're in.
And so then he, after a successful military career, then he goes back and he gets involved, politically speaking.
After he leads the troops up to the North Sea, where they famously say this used to be, back when Xenophon was on the lips of people in the 19th century, people used to say Thalasha, Thalasha, the sea. And the Greeks were so happy when Xenophon had finally succeeded in leading them up to the Black Sea.
Okay.
Then they make their way across to Byzantium. And then that's the end of the Anabasis. It's the successful rescue of at least the bulk of the Greek troops.
Okay.
But Xenophon does stay politically involved after that in other operations that are less dramatic and less carefully described.
Okay.
So,
and then how long after his engagement in politics does he then retire to?
By my calculations, it's about 6 years total, maybe a year and a half to 2 for the Anabasis itself, and then another 4 or 5 after that. And then he's a writer and a thinker.
And do people come and seek him out? Is he more in seclusion? How is
That's a good question. There are not, he doesn't write a book about it. So frankly, what you see is the product of how he uses his time rather than knowledge of what his day-to-day was like. His situation is somewhat remote. He's on an estate that's not too far from Olympia, Greece, where the Olympics were held and currently a tourist attraction. But what exactly happened there? Whether people did seek him out, that to me is a wonderfully interesting question, because Socrates' own philosophic activity was very public and done, well, not completely public, but done with others.
Yeah.
A lot of conversations. I don't know whether that was the case with Xenophon or not.
In the relationship between the Greeks and the Persians is a complicated one, to say the least. So why is it that a Greek is writing with such with such fascination about Persian leaders?
Yeah, good question. I think for a start, if you want to write about politics on the grandest scale, and you're living around the year 400 BC, Persia is your best option. That's the empire. The Greeks are divided into city-states, most of them remarkably small. Athens' citizen population was often estimated at 30,000, total population 110,000. But, that's the size of Boulder, Colorado. And yet they built the Parthenon. It's unbelievable.
Unbelievable.
So small Greek city-states, if you want to consider the subject of empire, you're almost compelled to turn to Sparta. To Persia for a good example of that. I also, don't know that Xenophon's discussion of either Cyrus or the Persia that he ruled is fully characterized by admiration. He may have been a Greek who didn't admire fully either Cyrus or Persia. Certainly, it's easier, I think, to suggest this with regard to Persia. One might think, no, it's better for human beings to live in smaller communities and not to have a despot who makes all of the decisions miles and miles and miles away from citizens. So I think he's definitely interested in Persia because it's a grand stage, not necessarily an admirer.
And the Persian Empire that he was writing about, so this is the one we'll get to, it was established by Cyrus the Great.
Correct.
How many years or centuries did that Persian Empire endure? And was it a highly centralized empire? Was it a fairly maybe compare it to other empires, the Roman Empire, in terms of its administration?
Yeah, that's a good question. And unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to give you a fully adequate answer, but it endures with ups and downs like the Roman Empire that went through some very difficult moments, of course, with assassinations, problems with the Praetorian Guard, terrible 3rd century AD for Rome. The Persian Empire certainly endured for several centuries, but also with sons fighting to take to who's going to inherit from the father, and with important degrees of insecurity. So Cyrus the Great founds the Persian Empire in about 530. He dies in about 530 BC. And then we get the Darius and Xerxes that lead the invasions into Greece that are successfully resisted by the Greeks to everyone's surprise. And then at around 400, Xenophon goes off to fight with one brother who's trying to overthrow his older brother. He fails to do that, but it's a sign of serious internal tensions within the empire. So I don't mean to suggest that that it always works perfectly.
Sure. So moving on to the education of Cyrus, which is the main focus of our conversation today. This is a book, Sir Philip Sidney, British poet and soldier, and he has this notable line where he talks about because this portrait of Cyrus is not necessarily real, it's imagined, and it's imagined well, that it has the power, the potency to create many more Cyruses, potentially, right? And it's this exercise of the political imagination. And you've seen other leaders, like Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, even Thomas Jefferson, perhaps for different reasons, was an admirer of the education, had 2 copies in his library at Monticello. So why is this book so powerful, so revered, but also why, others kind of have more of a word of caution? I think of Erasmus, has a line when he's writing his Education of a Christian Prince to the future Charles V. You might want to avoid the histories, of Xenophon. There's basically indicating that there's some kind of perhaps dangerous worldly wisdom in there that, better to stick with Cicero.
Okay.
So
interesting.
Why is this book so enduring and powerful?
Yeah, excellent. And I'm grateful for your citations. I didn't know about the Sidney passage, and I didn't know about Erasmus's cautions to Charles V. I'm very intrigued by that because as I was trying to anticipate where your question was going, I thought you were looking for how has the book been criticized, and the main, I'm going to get to why it's also been admired.
Sure.
That's much more important to me, and I'm much more in that camp. But I think one reason the book has been criticized is because from the perspective of its faulty history. So for those who think that the education of Cyrus is an adequate history of the Persian Empire, they're disappointed because they can see that Xenophon takes liberty with some of the more or less accepted facts about the Persian Empire and invents all kinds of other things with no historical foundation.
Is that criticism, is that a more modern thing?
Yes, I think that's the case. History professors maybe, I don't know, but Xenophon is not a scientific historian in this book, more so perhaps in the Hellenica, another book that he wrote. And so, my response to that, of course, is obvious. Why criticize a book that's not trying to be a history book for not being a history book? Maybe there's a reason to write a different kind of book. And I think that's also an interesting question of why is it that you might be able to convey some lessons better by departing from historical fact as opposed to sticking with it. I don't mean to say that that's an easy question, but I think that's what's involved. As for the appeal of, and then I wanted to say, I like what you were suggesting about the Erasmus criticism to Charles V, because I do think that the education of Cyrus has a Machiavellian component to it. I don't think it's defined exclusively by Machiavellianism, but I think that's present. So if you're looking for a Christian prince, really a Christian prince, there's some suggestions in the education of Cyrus that I think would be deeply problematic. So,
and on that, real quick on the Machiavelli point, one thing that I took minor issue, and of course I don't pretend to be as wise of a scholar as Harvey Mansfield, who's sort of the foremost Machiavelli political theorist, but he talks about the rupture that Machiavelli causes, kind of severing himself from, or his ideas from both the kind of the classical world and the Christian world, and from everything, above it and beneath it. And, to me, reading Xenophon felt somewhat similar to reading Machiavelli. I wasn't, I could see a lot of those kind of Machiavellian tendencies in Xenophon himself.
I think they're there. I can't deny them. I don't think it's the whole story.
Sure.
And I think Xenophon is much more careful than Machiavelli to, maybe I should say, clothe his teaching in more morally acceptable terms. So I don't think he's quite as eager to rub the reader's nose into some of the facts about political life, or what he considers to be the facts about political life and what rulers do and maybe have to do. Whereas Machiavelli seems to take great pleasure sometimes, when he says,
and shocking,
when the Meritocracy chops, it gets chopped into 4 pieces by Cesare Borgia, and the people are soddisfatti e stupiti, they're satisfied and stupefied. I mean, he seems to like that very tough moment.
Yeah, whereas Xenophon is much more subtle, and you don't know whether he's giving a wholehearted endorsement of Cyrus's kind of approach to governing, which we'll talk about, or if it's sort of a veiled criticism. It's much more complex.
I think that's true. I also think it's not easy. I think it's possible to read The Education of Cyrus without seeing the extent to which there are some dirty secrets revealed in it. And to see, Cyrus, going back to the question of why has it been admired and appreciated, I think this is wonderful, even though I'm reminded by you that Xenophon is not on everyone's lips. Xenophon's, all of his writings, as far as we can tell, have survived 2,500 years. That's not bad. And what is it that would enable these writings to survive? And what is the basis of the appeal, I think, is a wonderful and important question. And I would say that at least part of the answer to this, not the whole story, but part of the answer is the attractiveness of Cyrus. We might say the superficial or initial attractiveness of Cyrus. I don't know that it stands up to scrutiny, but he's good looking. He's moral. He looks morally upright. He's tremendously controlled. He's got deep self-control, moderation, continence. He can go days eating only a lettuce leaf, in contrast to ever so many powerful American leaders. He never exploits his situation for sexual favors or anything like that. He even has the most beautiful woman of all of Asia put into his hands, essentially, and he says, no, we'll respect this woman, and she's not going to be treated like that. So it seems to me, he's regarded. These names won't mean a lot to everybody, but one of his followers, Gadatas, thinks, oh my gosh, where did this benefactor come from? The Hyrcanians, oh my gosh, where did this wonderful ally come from? So there's I think, moral qualities that make him attractive. He's physically beautiful, that doesn't hurt. Intellectually, he's sharp. And this is brought out by contrast with his uncle, who's not. So I think he's an attractive leader. And he rights many wrongs because he goes on to overthrow the Assyrian Empire and the countries that have been held down, like the Soviet Union, the countries, you smash the Soviet Union and really smash it, then you're liberating countries, and that makes him attractive. So I think part of the appeal of The Education of Cyrus is, in fact, that Cyrus is, at least superficially, very attractive. And we like that.
Definitely.
He's a hero.
Yeah.
There are other things, but that's where I would start there.
So are there other historic figures that come to mind, either statesmen or philosophers, who are really kind of pro Cyrus, pro the education, besides the ones that I mentioned that stand out?
Well, you've implied, perhaps without adding them explicitly to this list, but Machiavelli refers to Cyrus, I think, 4 times in his Prince, and mentions Cyrus as one of the 4 great leaders of the world to be emulated. And I think the implication is that Cyrus is the Cyrus of Xenophon's. So Machiavelli is right there. I don't know, frankly, of another major thinker like a Hobbes, a Locke, a Montesquieu, a Rousseau, a Nietzsche. I don't know that any one of them ever referred to The Education of Cyrus.
In the American founders, so obviously Jefferson had several copies in his library, thought he was a model of perhaps religious toleration, or an early seed form of kind of religious toleration. But what about any of the other, were Hamilton and Adams
not
familiar
to my
with?
knowledge.
Not to your knowledge.
Not to my knowledge, no.
And what would you say is there a golden age of kind of Xenophon scholarship?
It's coming.
It's coming. Okay. After this episode comes out, we're leading the charge. All right. Well,
the Romans.
The Romans, yeah.
Yes. Your Sidney contrasted Cicero and Xenophon, but Cicero apparently carried Xenophon's education of Cyrus with him.
Okay.
And also said that Scipio Africanus did the same. So I think Xenophon actually had a pretty good following in the late Republic, at least in Rome.
All right.
But nothing compared to what's about to happen.
That's right. That's great. I'm wholly supportive of that. So this book, The Education of Cyrus, can you summarize the main plot and character for those who've not read it before?
It's a story about a young man who goes off to defend his country against an expected attack by a powerful empire. It's the Assyrian Empire. And not only does defeat the Assyrian Empire, but goes on to destroy that empire, liberate the subject people from that empire, while adding to his own power and his own alliance. So toward the end of the book, at the end of book 7 out of the 8 books that constitute the education of Cyrus, Cyrus is in a position to rule the world. So that's the simple plot. It's the story of remarkable political genius, remarkable political success. And you could say the concluding theme, is Cyrus leads a life that is long and comfortable, and he dies a natural death, and is able to think of himself as blessed by the gods and hand down this authority to his 2 sons. So that's the main plot. Now, obviously, there are all sorts of subplots and little curlicues that complicate things, but that's the gist.
Definitely. Well, I want to begin actually with a short passage at the very beginning of this book, a claim that Xenophon makes about kind of political rule and political instability and how to resolve that. He writes, "Now when we considered these things, we inclined to this judgment about them. It is easier, given his nature, for human beings to rule all of the other kinds of animals than to rule human beings. But when we reflected that there was a Cyrus, a Persian who acquired very many people, very many cities, and very many nations, all obedient to himself, we were thus compelled to change our mind to the view that ruling human beings does not belong among those tasks that are impossible, or even among those that are difficult, if one does it with knowledge." So he locates the solution to the political problem in knowledge, right? The political problem of instability and who rules. And that's a pretty bold claim. And then he says, Cyrus did it, and here's how he did it. So what do you make of that claim? How does Xenophon answer that throughout the book?
Yeah, I think that I'm very grateful to you for reading that passage. I think that's key because it also puts my previous comment in its proper context. It doesn't begin as a biography. I'd like to tell you about Cyrus. It begins with a statement of a political problem. It's an observation. Rule is very difficult. There's no form of government that is immune to the risk of being overthrown. Monarchies are overthrown, tyrannies are overthrown, oligarchies are overthrown, and alas, democracies are overthrown. They're all subject to revolution, and that's a huge political problem. It reminds me of and it's also put in the context that's somewhat comical, I think, of how easy it is for human beings to rule over certain other species, like cattle, even though that rule is exploitative. We just use the cattle for whatever we want, usually for dinner. And we ruled them successfully, no revolutions. But when it comes to ruling human beings, there's the huge problem. It's very reminiscent, I think, of Federalist 51, where, Madison observes that men are not angels, and this complicates the problem of rule tremendously, and there are no angels available to govern men. So there we have to be human beings that rule other human beings. That's the problem that Cyrus is introduced as solving. So thank you. And I think you're also right. The Greek word is epistemonos. The solution is to do it with science or with knowledge. That's how to overcome this problem. But you express properly wonder at this. Really, can we solve this problem with this knowledge? And I think you're right to express wonder. I think it's interesting that the narrator at this point is in the plural. We, and later Xenophon will speak in the singular, I. And I don't think Xenophon fully endorses the conclusion that knowledge is sufficient. And therefore, I think the book is also a demonstration that what leadership requires, successful leadership, is more than knowledge. And I think that this starts in the very next sentence after the one you read, because he says, all right, now let's look at Cyrus, this man who solves the problem. What is his birth like? What is his nature like? And how is he educated? Well, only that third, the education, would relate to the knowledge. His birth and his nature introduce factors in him that are important for what he does, that are different from what he knows. For example, he's the son of a king who is thought to have descended from the gods. That's an advantage that not everybody has. It's not just knowledge. And his nature, among other things, is to love honor. He pursues honor like a madman. If he didn't pursue honor, it's quite possible he could have known everything that he did know about political life without having been quite so hungry to exercise rule over others. So I think, though the book begins with a simple thesis, knowledge is sufficient, what it shows is that knowledge is necessary,
but not sufficient. And even that knowledge is not, even the knowledge itself, if you isolate it, is not merely, kind of just reading and writing, right? It's knowledge that's gained by experience, which the experiences are experiences that, most people don't have in life. It's not like if you study Xenophon in college, or if you're a grad student, you write your dissertation on Xenophon, then you're not immediately ready to go kind of conquer and rule the world. I mean, there's a lot that
I think that's
you need to learn.
That's a great point. And to tell you the truth, I don't think I wasn't thinking of, it wasn't in my mind, so I'm glad you mentioned it. I think the demonstration from the text of your point is that Cyrus, as a boy, is sent for about 3 years to live with his grandfather, who's the tyrant of Medea. That experience is tremendously formative. That's not book learning in support of your point. He sees there a different kind of rule, a different attitude toward governance. He's introduced to other pleasures and refinements of life. He has leadership experience because his grandfather will say, you want to take the boys and go hunting? Here's 10 horses, have a good time. I mean, he has all sorts of experiences that he wouldn't have had if he stayed just in his boyhood Persia. It's, study abroad with a vengeance.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to get to the 3 educations that Cyrus had. But before that, let's say, okay, so going back to this question, let's say if knowledge is the solution to the political problem, which we have reason to believe that it is not, or it's not, maybe it's part of it, but not the whole. What does that imply about the role of education in politics, either for Xenophon or, just in your own estimation? Because if knowledge is really key, then education is really the foundation of having a great leader.
I happen to believe it. I mean, the trick is to find that education, and what is that education? What does it consist in? What's the curriculum? And I think that's very tricky business. And even with a question like, well, what role might the Cyropaideia play in this curriculum? I find that not an easy question, but an important question. So I'm absolutely convinced that the knowledge is key, but I'm in the embarrassing position of not always being confident that I can say, well, this, and this. I think it's the case that there's not a recipe that that everyone can simply imbibe, and then all of a sudden they'll be politically competent, politically capable. And so it's a mistake to try to race to lessons from a complicated book, you end up with 4 great lessons.
Sure.
Something like that. That's a problem. But that's the Scylla. But the Charybdis on the other side is, do you say that you don't learn anything and that you don't need knowledge? That's crazy. So when you think of men like Churchill and, how their education prepared them to be the great leaders that they were, or even Lincoln with his education in a poor house on the prairie. I mean, reading Shakespeare, the American founding fathers, I think these are examples of men who learned a tremendous amount and whose education helped them to be the great statesmen that they were. So I'm a big fan of education.
Sure.
But that leaves open the question of what is the best form for that education.
Definitely. And that, to put you on the spot, let's say you were putting together a curriculum, or you were putting together, let's say, a few great books for someone who you knew was going to be, I don't know how you would know in advance, but you knew they were going to be the president of the United States one day, right? Would if you could pick 3 to 5 books, would Xenophon's Education be one of them? And what other great philosophers or works of literature or history would you include?
Well, frankly, I'd start with the Federalist Papers, the Constitution and the Federalist Papers, which I find absolutely remarkable documents. And they have the advantage not only of teaching a great deal about our regime and the reason it is the way they are, they also have the advantage of countering many prevalent prejudices today, I think. I mean, they're explicitly, in number 10, anti-democratic to some extent. There's no confidence that the majority will always rule wisely or well. So there's an explicit recognition of the need to temper majoritarian rule by other considerations and checks and balances. I think that's, it just seems like something we've completely forgotten. I think they teach it well. I think they would also, for students who took them seriously, they would learn respect for the founding generation because they're really remarkable documents. So I would start there. And I would probably go to Lincoln next and look at the Lyceum speech and the Temperance Address and some of the debates that Lincoln did. So I think if it's a limited and short list, I hope he doesn't get angry at me, Cyrus. But
you would go.
Xenophon,
I mean, it makes sense.
I would start with America.
Yeah.
The great books about the American tradition, I think, are more immediate need at a certain stage of the game. I do think it's useful and important to open one's eyes and see a still larger world of politics out there. And I think the education of Cyrus or Thucydides, the history of the Peloponnesian War, I think I would go to works of political history before I would go to works of the great political philosophers. Before I'd say Locke or Hobbes or Kant or Hegel or Rousseau, I'd say read Thucydides. I was struck. I think it's number 6 in the Federalist Papers. Hamilton says something like, experience that best oracle of wisdom. Well, by experience, he means history. And what he means is history can correct our naive expectations about how the world operates. History can show us how people have been deceived by naive ideas. I think that's a very important lesson. So I'm putting Thucydides on my list.
That's great.
At a certain stage of the game, it might not be much longer, but I would say the education of Cyrus deserves serious consideration.
Plutarch's Lives, is that up there?
Plutarch's Lives, sure. That's very good. Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, which he draws a lot of that from Plutarch, I think would be a wonderful addition.
We're reading that in ISI's summer honors program. We'll include Shakespeare's Caesar this summer.
I think it's a wonderful play. Reading Churchill, I think, would be wonderful. So
definitely.
Yeah.
So getting back
but
again.
I'm not abandoning him.
I'm
just trying to position him on very distinct.
If we're going to lead the Xenophon revival, we have to have it at the top of the list. So back to the 3 educations of Cyrus. One is in Persia, one is in Media, then the other is from his father.
That's my count.
That's your count.
Yeah.
There could be more.
Somebody might see
so yeah, can you share a little bit about each of those?
Sure. I'll start by saying that the title of the book is a bit odd, and Xenophon has a couple books with odd titles. Why call this The Education of Cyrus when it's a book about Cyrus conquering the world? But he does have three educations. And by the way, the title could technically mean also the education or any education that Cyrus teaches. So it could be the educations he receives, of which I think there are three major ones, but could also be the education, any education that he imparts, which I think would, in my mind, refer especially to the speech he gives to the peers in Book 1, Chapter 5. But now the three educations, Medea, Persia, and, I'll do it in a different order. Persia, Medea, and a conversation with his father at the very end of Book 1, Chapter 6. He's born into Persia. His father is a very limited monarch, so he doesn't have extraordinary powers. He might have some religious functions, but Persia is a republic. We learn sort of later that it's a very narrow republic, or we might say oligarchic republic, because it's ruled by a small fraction of the total population, and it's a very austere republic in which the citizens are constantly exercising, doing push-ups, preparing for war, military training, hunting, and this is the way they defend themselves. This may be the way they defend themselves against the lower class, but also the way they defend themselves against foreign powers. So in that chapter, Book 1, Chapter 2, Cyrus's name is not even mentioned, and that makes sense because there is no individuality in this society. Everyone is beaten into being a citizen. There's a strict uniformity, and personal characteristics can't show themselves. Then, for reasons I don't quite understand, his parents allowed him to go and visit Granddad, and Granddad lives in Medea. This is the father of his mother. His mother's name is Mandane. The tyrant of Medea is named Astyages, and there, I think he's about 12 or 13. He stays for 3 or 4 years. His eyes are opened to a completely different world because his grandfather owns everything, can do anything. He is the law. There is none of the republican austerity that he's used to. So he learns about fine food, which he doesn't care for. He learns about beautiful clothes. He learns to ride a horse. And in addition to what he learns, he also shows more his character because he's completely free. I mean, grandfathers always flatter their grandsons, their grandchildren, and let them do what they want. And so this tyrant does, but he has everything at his disposal. So we see that Cyrus really does love honor. We see that Cyrus is eager to learn more about war. We see that he loves hunting, and we see that he's daring to the point of madness. And then the third education, I think, is a wonderful introduction to the heart of the book, is when Cyrus has been chosen by the peers, the Persian upper class, to lead the army that will join with their allies, the Medea, now led by Cyaxares, the son of the old tyrant I just mentioned, and they will go out to meet the Assyrian army that is coming to attack. At least that's the report. And so for one last time, Cyrus is at the head of 31,000 Persian troops. His father has a little chat with him. So here are a couple of things I'd like to review that we've talked about in the past, and here's some other things I'd like to add to our prior conversations, loosely put. And then he gives a series of advice, bits of tips about how to rule. And I think you can see, if you have doubts about the character of the education of Cyrus or Xenophon's competence to teach us how to rule or things that are important for how to rule, I would say read that one chapter. It's only 10 pages. Read it 3 or 4 times. See the list of subjects that come up and how they're treated. So those are that's a quick outline of the 3 educations.
3 educations. So let's start with Persia. A couple of things, you mentioned. So there's a town square,
Yes.
and the elders of the city are there, imparting kind of lessons and wisdom to the younger. The pupils, when they're not engaged in hunts or other kind of physical activity. One notable group of people that's absent or banished from the town square is the merchant class.
Yes, that's true.
So what is the one, why are they banished? And if you're kind of looking at from the lens of, political theory or political philosophy, is there a kind of a natural tension between kind of the merchant class and the political class or the philosophical class? Why are they kept at such an arm's length?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. First, it is a clear evidence that this is not a commercial republic. And it's one of the ways in which this Persian republic is very different from a modern republic,
Sure.
of course. I think it's also a way of showing they're attempting to teach the citizens of this republic the elevated character of public life by contrasting it with something that seems to be, from the perspective of the regime, to be baser, more ordinary, more concerned with the mere necessities of human existence. So in this regime, they try to teach the young boys, this is said explicitly, that they must be virtuous, they must serve the common good. That's an explicit part of the education. It's not an easy subject to teach. And in doing that, they find commerce an activity where presumably you're motivated by gain, and as you participate in it, they perceive that to be an activity of a very different status. And so they put it aside. It has to be done. It's a necessity. But they devote the heart and soul of their public life to the exercises, not only physical exercises, but also intellectual exercises that the regime requires for their dedication to it.
And let's say, you're looking at the American founders, obviously Hamilton, I think he could be described as the architect of American capitalism. He wrote a report on manufacturers. He had a very clear understanding of how the market and commerce would play a role in kind of establishing the greatness of our commercial republic. Is there much, I don't know, can you shed any light on perhaps how our own founders kind of reconciled the virtues of the market economy with the kind of the Republican virtues they wanted to instill? Why didn't they follow the path of Xenophon and banish the merchants or keep them at bay? Was it necessity, or was it, there's something else going on?
It's an excellent question. And, I don't know that I can respond adequately, but here's my thought on the matter, is that the American regime, although we use the word republic to describe it, and we use the word republic to describe the Persian, the American regime is a liberal republic, by which that its first principle is the liberty of the individual. So the Declaration says that we're endowed with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of the happiness. And that to protect these rights, then we consent to a government, and the government derives its authority from our consent and our belief that we need to give that consent in order to get our own individual rights. That's completely alien to Persia and to the ancient republic, I would say. And that they begin, no, what's first is not the individual right. What's first is the common good. And the individual has a duty to support that common good. And that's the primary fact. And everything that might suggest my right, that needs to be put into the background or pushed aside in favor of the duty. And so I think the founders, I think the founders have a tough job of trying, I think we in the United States have a tough job of teaching citizenship at the same time that we start by saying your rights are primary and fundamental. Then the citizenship becomes diminished, and because it's derivative.
And we don't hear about the duties that accompany the rights.
Not so much, and if we hear about them, they don't have the same force because the rights.
Sure. So
I think that, it's a very important question, but I think that's a, big difference between the two. My personal opinion is that it is difficult in the United States, where we have a harder job establishing that, we citizens need to serve a common good. That's just an absolute necessity of decent politics. You can't always be thinking of yourself first. And it's difficult because of the tradition, certain aspects of the tradition, at least, of modern liberal thought. That's my take on it.
No, I appreciate that. Another thing you mentioned is the individual, right? And how there wasn't much conception, much understanding of the individual in Persia, in this old kind of classical republican model.
Oh, right.
At what point historically do you believe, maybe I guess there's there's a historical question, but then there's perhaps the question of when do you see this emerge in political theory, the idea of the individual in the way that we understand it in a more, maybe it came to understand it more fully in a modern sense, but where does that really emerge? Obviously, some people would say that emerges with Christianity, but with some understanding of natural law. But where do you see kind of the individual emerging?
Yeah, I wouldn't say Christianity. I would say with Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. Okay. And the idea that...
So that late?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, obviously, there's all sorts of reasons to be selfish. And,
sure.
People have felt those reasons throughout all of human history. And so having felt them, they've obviously given voice to them. But in terms of systematic theories that try to establish how to build good government based on the primacy of individual rights, that's what I attribute with Hobbes and Locke. Yeah. And I mean, they look at human beings in a state of nature prior to civil society. This is what they're trying to do. And they detect that it's a terrible situation. So to get out of that terrible situation for their own sake, for their own reasons, they have to give up some fraction of their liberty, which they do to form a government that will protect them and secure their rights. So that seems to me an explanation of political society that makes a certain degree of sense. And I think you can see some places in Aristotle's Politics where this kind of idea was anticipated, but not endorsed by Aristotle. And it makes a certain amount of sense, but it also comes with some hardships, I think.
And I think you see, I guess maybe with kind of to clarify the Christianity point, I think you see perhaps maybe more clearly, I don't know, let's say in the 12th and 13th century, kind of in the Middle Ages, you do see kind of maybe the beginnings of there's more of an emphasis on individual piety. There are kind of spiritual movements that emerge that are focused much more intensely on kind of the individual conscience and the imitation of Christ, and that I think you probably don't see as much in the first 1,000 years of Christianity. So humans have been organizing themselves in political society for how long, would you say?
Thousands of
years, right? So presumably for 5,000-6,000 years, they've been organizing in political society. But it's not until the mid 17th century, after thousands of years, that this idea of the individual really even comes to the foreground.
I would say the idea of individual rights. I mean, obviously, everybody before then thought for a while, I'm an individual, you know, and I got to look out for my own skin, and I've got to provide for my family. And so there's plenty of reasons for egoism. Egoism is known since the beginning. I'm really trying to put my figure on a theoretical solution to the political problem that begins from the assertion of individual rights. And that, I mean, what is a right? Where do they come from? Who gives them to us? I don't know that is a common question in political talk.
Why don't you think the ancients, why didn't they ask that?
Well, they had legal rights, and so they're up for negotiation. I mean, under these circumstances, we grant these rights under the law, and only these rights under the laws, as opposed to starting. This is the fundamental principle by nature, right? Why not duty? Why not God? I think those are also likely or more likely starting points for political theorizing than I've got my right.
Okay. Well, once again, getting back to Cyrus. So he has these 3 educations. He's, got some parting advice from his father. Then he, goes on these military campaigns, right? He has his army. Talk about what changes what changes did he implement in this army of his to be as successful as he was?
Yeah. I think it's interesting, and you're ahead of the game, I think, to realize that he did make changes, because I think a quick reading of the book, you see he gets an army and he goes off and he fights this war. But when Cyrus is given control of the army, Book 1, Chapter 5, 31,000 troops, thereafter he makes 4 main changes in the army. And the first, I think, is so radical. It's breathtaking. And I think a mystery, if I thought that Xenophon was capable of a mistake, and I don't, I might think, well, why doesn't he say more about how Cyrus was able to do this in Persia? Because it's too radical. I would think the Persian authorities would be after him and throw him in jail the next day. But this is all leading up to Book 1, Chapter 5. He gives a speech to his newly chosen peers. These are the upperclassmen. He's got 1,000 of these. Each of them will go out and choose 30 others. That will create the 31,000 troops. And to these peers, he says, loose paraphrase, our grandfathers, our tradition is really a wonderful tradition. Our grandfathers were great, but I don't see that they ever got anything from the virtues that they worked so hard to develop and practice. Nothing. So they did push-ups all day. They ate watercress and lettuce when they could have had meat or drunk wine. They didn't get anything from this. This is ridiculous. I think this is like a farmer who prepares the soil of his farm and then plants his seed, and then he never bothers to harvest the crop. It's time now that we change things and start the harvest. We need to get what our virtue, our excellence, our military skill, our various kinds of adroitness, what that can get us, and it can get us victory. So keep that in mind. So he transforms the Persian understanding of virtue, I would say, from virtue being the end of education, the purpose or goal to be excellent, into a means for conquest. And I mean, maybe this is a slight exaggeration, but not too big, I don't think. It changes what looks like a defensive war. The Assyrians are coming. We've got to protect ourselves, into an offensive opportunity for his soldiers. We're tough. We beat these guys. Look at what we got. Yeah. We've got rewards like we've never had before. He doesn't say that explicitly, but that's an implication. So that's Reform 1.
So
I think it's
let's focus on that for a second. So there's a way in which that could be corrosive, right? In the sense of virtue is not its own reward anymore, right?
Absolutely.
And that there are other pleasures which your virtue can serve. And for Cyrus, those are less sexual pleasures or, food, wine, and it's empire, right? It's honor.
He mentions pleasure and honor.
Pleasure and honor.
And wealth. Pleasure, wealth, and honor are the 3 possible goals that virtue can serve.
Okay. Pleasure, wealth, and honor. So there's a sense in which that could potentially be corrosive, right? If the pleasure, the wealth, the honor are I guess, used inappropriately or sought for the wrong ends. But there's also a sense in which this kind of makes sense, in the sense of even if you're looking at it from kind of a Christian context, you go through Lent, right? It's a period of repentance, a period of you're making sacrifices, you're abstaining from certain foods, you're taking up other kind of spiritual disciplines, but then you make it to Easter, right? And it's a feast, right? And the things that you didn't eat for the duration of Lent, you get to enjoy. And there's a reward at the end. Or even you think of the Christian life as a whole, there's a certain moral code that you follow, right? And there is a reward at the end of your life. And it's not just a reward for your good works. Obviously, it's by grace, cooperation with grace, but there's a reward of, it's eternal life with God. And so you restrain your passions now for pleasures that are greater than you would even understand to be physical pleasures at a future point. So, is this not just, or if you think of you're a football team and you want to win the Super Bowl, and so honor or glory is kind of what's motivating you.
Sure, wealth too.
Wealth.
Your contract next year will be double.
It'll be double, right? And so there's a sense in which it's just kind of, this is how humans operate. Like you get them to be more disciplined now for the promise of some reward, a bonus at a job, or et cetera. So how is this? Why do you think this is perhaps more corrosive or not than just how you would normally incentivize people to really do anything?
Well, first of all, I think it is very good advice from the point of Cyrus's goal. He wants to win this war. And beyond that, he may wish to create an empire, and he needs enthusiastic troops to do that. This adds a dimension or an element of enthusiasm. So I don't mean to say it's foolish advice, but with regard to its corrosiveness, I think it's different from the Christian case that you mentioned, as I understand it in any event. In this way, the Christian has his rules, and those rules are firmly in place. And they allow a certain degree of enjoyment when Lent is over, but those rules are themselves not mutable. Once Cyrus teaches these soldiers that the ends are wealth, pleasure, and honor, then they, I think, are at liberty to wonder, what are the best means to get these ends? And the rules then may very well change, depending on the circumstances that they're in. They may think they may think that, I'm thinking months down the road, they may think, oh, Cyrus has just ordered me to go defend this isolated outpost, but the risks are very high. My goals are pleasure, wealth, and honor. Well, at the moment, I'm not that concerned about honor. I'm scared about losing my life if I go do this, so pleasure will lead me to go somewhere else. I mean, first of all, will the troops on balance be more motivated by honor or by pleasure? If these are the three possible motivations that are now
probably pleasure and wealth, I would say.
I would say too. Are those the best motives for an army over the long haul? They may get you going. But it's also quite possible that at a certain stage of the game, the risks of combat, the risks of war will come into mind. Also, after all, if you get yourself killed, you're not getting the pleasure, you're not getting the wealth. So I think that's the problem that I'm kind of concerned about, is if you change the end, don't you liberate others to choose the means, to judge the means for themselves? And will that lead them back to Persian virtue?
Probably
or
not.
Somewhere else.
And to make a very kind of crude, kind of modern day example, this is something that's going on in college football with, individual players now, for their name, image, and likeness can receive massive monetary awards.
Excellent example.
In that, maybe you could say it makes the individual player perhaps maybe more, I don't know, physically excellent, motivated, but it also kind of kills the whole team nature of the sport. And it's now no longer about the team. It's about me, right? And money.
It's an excellent example, I think, yes.
So there's a way in which some of these rewards can be corrosive. The second thing he does is he arms the commoners.
Yes.
How does that change the nature of the Persian regime? It radically changes it.
Yeah, that's a good question and a very important point. And what one needs to know first is that the Persian regime has a sharp class difference. There are the peers and there are the commoners. And the peers have heavy weapons and they're trained in the use of heavy weapons. And the peers, which maybe 30 times as many as the peers. It's not entirely clear, but it's a much larger fraction of the population, are held in check, I presume, in good measure, because the peers have these heavy weapons. So they make a much more effective fighter. And Cyrus, in order to improve the fighting capacity of his army, concludes, well, I can't get any more soldiers than I have. I need to make a qualitative change because the quantity isn't going to change. The most qualitative change that I can make is to arm the commoners. Well, think about it. That's all of a sudden 30,000 commoners that now have these heavy weapons. I'm prepared to assert they won't go home again. They certainly won't put their weapons down. They might go home again and say, now we're peers. You guys are out of a job. Or something like that. But and so this is a second very radical move. Cyrus does not write home and say, dear Dad, or dear Persian common, ruling group, would you mind if I armed the commoners? He doesn't do that. In fact, he doesn't even ask the peers, would you mind if I arm the commoners? He just says, I've been so worried about you. I'm scared to have you on the front lines there. I'm going to give these arms to the commoners so that they can stand side by side with you, and that will improve your situation. I think it's a wonderful example of how he defends his new policy in 3 or 4 different ways, depending on the group that he's speaking to. How he defends it to the commoners, how he defends it to the peers, how he defends it to his uncle Cyaxares. But it's a revolutionary act.
And with far-reaching consequences, I imagine. So after arming the commoners, he introduces a system of meritocracy. Was that something that they had before in any way, shape, or form, or is that was another innovation?
My inference is that no, it was an innovation, because it seems like Cyrus has to introduce it as a change. This is also a way of adding an incentive to the forces if you're going to get rewards not based on your equality with everybody else, but based on your superior performance. But it's also, of course, very useful to Cyrus, because who's going to judge who performs better? Well, I'll do that, says Cyrus. So suddenly everybody has an incentive to look good, at least in the eyes of Cyrus, or in the report that Cyrus hears. And it's also a good way, I think, to reassure the peers that the promotion of the commoners is not going to completely eliminate the advantages that they've always enjoyed, because they'll think, oh, we're going to get rewarded on merit.
We are the most
I know, we're the best, so we'll get more. So it's I think a clever policy in multiple ways.
Were there any other changes he made to the army?
Introducing a cavalry, I think, is also important. The Persia is presented by Xenophon as a hilly country, so they don't learn how to ride horses. Cyrus would like the Persians to have control over the overall alliance, and for that control over the overall alliance, I'm attributing that motive to him. I mean, other readers might not see it, but I think his goal is to have control over the whole alliance, and to achieve that, he needs to have different component parts of his army that will allow him to enjoy that control. Those are the main changes he makes to the Persian army, in my understanding.
And then does he keep with the army of 30,000? Does that grow, expand over time?
He does get reinforcements later from Persia. He writes home and says, "Dear Dad, if you want Persia to have control of all of Asia, send another group of Persians." And they do send another group of Persian commoners. It's interesting to me that they send commoners, not peers. I think that's a sign that they want to maintain the peers' control over the Persian regime, so they're willing to let the underclass go, but they want to keep the ruling class present. So
and the allies that join them along the way, as he's conquering and building this empire, what motive or incentive do they have? What does he promise them?
That's a wonderful question. I don't think I thought about this until somewhat recently anyway. My first thought was this, that he doesn't have that big an army compared to the other forces at play, either to his ally, the Medes, or to the Assyrians in their alliance. So he needs allies. And so I think always was aware that he added bulk by adding the allies. And then it's a question of how do you get the allies? How does he treat them? How does he assure that they'll be faithful to him, et cetera, et cetera? But as your question just implied, I think, cleverly, the allies come with various different motives, and this can make them very useful to him. So the initial motive for Persia is mere defense, save the fatherland from the attack of the Assyrians. But when when there's a group called the Hyrcanians that revolt from the Assyrian alliance, again, like the Soviet Union, if you really smash it, you're gonna get spin-offs of Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, the Kazakhstan, et cetera, and these spin-offs will be looking for allies to protect themselves in the future. The Hyrcanians defect from the Assyrian alliance, but they're very vulnerable because they live right next to the Assyrians, the way Persia does not. So they need Assyria to be destroyed, or at least really hurt badly for their own safety. Persia didn't need that. So by adding the Hyrcanians as an ally, he adds a new motive for fighting, or a new possible stopping point, not just after a defeat, but after annihilation or something approaching that. And that's true also for his addition of Gobrias and Gadatas, two other allies that he brings into his forces. Gadatas is especially vulnerable. Without a complete defeat of Assyria, he and all his lands and power is going to be destroyed. So I think I think it's very clever, Cyrus, by adding allies, not only adds bulk, he adds new motives, and motives that will keep the army going and keep them from just going back to Persia even after Assyria is destroyed. Cyrus is not about bringing the boys home. He's about keeping the boys going.
And so keeping the boys going, there's a number, we talked about kind of the changes he made in the army, which are more concrete or structural changes, but he has a number of tactics that he employs to reward his friends, punish his enemies. And I think these are pretty striking as you read them, right? So a few of them that come to mind, he uses, rewards and punishments, particularly rewards through the form of competition to kind of incentivize certain types of behavior. We talked about his restraint when it comes to matters of food and drink and women. Even, talking about how restraint in itself is a feast, because it'll allow you to enjoy kind of a larger banquet of things, at some point in the future. He uses praise and flattery. There's a number of other kind of, tricks. At one point, he even kind of wears makeup and platform shoes, which we'll get to once he establishes empire. But, he's very clever at how he wins men to himself, wins friends so that he can then harvest glory later. What do you make of these tactics? Are they effective? Are they necessary? Is there another way he could have done it to attain the end of the empire that he wanted?
Yeah, well, limiting myself to at least one point that you mentioned, I think he's good, and that we can learn something from him in his ability to recruit allies and to keep allies. He realizes that allies join an alliance because they want something from that alliance, and what they want is a strong, consistent, and constant partner who will help them achieve their objectives. And Cyrus, interestingly, doesn't ask too many questions about the justice of why an ally might want to join him. He's very concerned about the justice of Armenia in the beginning of book 3, and makes the Armenian feel like he's been very unjust. But when it comes to the Hyrcanians, he doesn't ask too many questions. And the reason is that allies don't want to have to answer these kinds of questions. They want support. They don't want scrutiny. I happen to be thinking about the Middle East at the moment and a certain recent change in U.S. policy. And Cyrus, I think, is a good ally for them. And a great example of this is Gadatas, who has a fortress in more or less in Assyrian territory, and when he revolts to Cyrus, that is all threatened, and so Gadatas has to say, "I'll see you guys. I got to race home and defend my fortress." And the minute he's gone, Cyrus calls his troops and says, "We've got to go help that man. We've got to go protect him. Get yourselves ready for one heck of a hard, fast march because he needs us. And if we don't defend our allies and show that we care about their interests, we're going to lose all our allies. But if we show that we will defend them, we'll find many more that are ready to come and to join us." His troops say, "Right on." And they go and have this wonderful defense of Gadatas. And then Gadatas basically says, "I can't believe you did this out of the goodness of your heart." I mean, what an amazing and generous gesture. I owe you a deep debt of gratitude. Completely misunderstands that Cyrus had a motive for doing what he did, that he's doing that because he needs to do that to get further allies in the future. And he was public about it with his troops. So that I think Cyrus is very adroit in his ability to perceive the needs of allies and to serve those needs and to avoid, I mean, if you really need the ally, he really needs the allies, to avoid asking embarrassing questions, I suppose.
So throughout the story, right, half of it is, setting aside the part about his education, half of it is sort of him conquering, right?
Yeah.
And kind of the culmination or the turning point is when he conquers Babylon.
Correct.
And, the Babylonians are partying, they're drunk, they're debased, right? And he finds a way through his, his sober men to kind of conquer the city. Notably, I read that there was a liberation even of the Jewish people at that point. He's the only person who is considered to be a type of Messiah among the Jews who's not a Jew. But I'm wondering, once he then is ruling this empire of his, how does his approach to leadership change as a conqueror and military leader versus as the emperor and the ruler?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. It's a big question, a difficult question, but it's a wonderful question. And because Cyrus says explicitly, so the conquest of the last battle, the conquest of Sardis, then the conquest of Babylon occur in Book 7. The last chapter of Book 7, Cyrus says explicitly to his troops, okay, we've conquered everything, but I want you to realize that to preserve our rule, to rule what we've conquered, we're going to need to change our conduct. To conquer, mostly what you need is just daring. We've done that. Now we're going to need extraordinary self-restraint. We're going to need careful policy. We're going to need to organize this empire. After all, here we are in Babylon, where we are hated more than anyone else. Our subjects hate us because we defeated them. We've taken their things to reward our allies and ourselves. We have to bear that in mind. And then Cyrus institutes a series of policies. I can try a list if you want one.
Sure.
Try a series of policies about what ruling actually requires, governing as opposed to conquest. And it's striking. And I think one huge question in the book is, well, really, how much are we supposed to admire Cyrus? And a lot of readers, I think, will admire Cyrus for the reasons that I stated earlier and the reasons that I admired him when I first read the book. He has at least a facade of virtue and a facade, and he does liberate some subject people, etc. But a crucial section of the book for evaluating Cyrus, I think, is this final stage. What does he do to hold on to his empire? And to be just brief about it, without listing the various policies, I would say my summary judgment is he's very nasty. He's very clever, and it's very difficult to admire him from a moral point of view and what he does here. It may be Xenophon's illustration of what rule under the circumstances requires, but I wouldn't want to be the one who pursued these policies.
So I'm interested. So when I read it, and again, I've not studied it, you've devoted your whole life to this. I guess
not really, but
okay. Well,
a good chunk.
So a couple of things struck me when he's ruling. The first thing was that, oh wow, I would have thought that more discipline, more restraint is required for a military campaign than it is for actual governing and ruling. And for him, he seemed it's time to double down on the restraint once he's actually in charge of the empire. But there's another sense in which, okay, the people that he's conquered, even though he does put, he has his representatives or his ambassadors who are kind of watching them, have their eyes on them. I don't know if he allows them to be armed or not, but it seems like there is some degree of, he kind of lets his conquered peoples kind of keep their own traditions, keep their own religious habits and customs, right? And so it does, in time, at least in Cyrus's telling, they come to love him. They come to acclaim him as the father of the empire. So to me, I wasn't as, you're right that there are certain tactics that he uses, which I think cross certain moral boundaries, but it's not, I guess when I read it, I didn't question as profoundly the wisdom or the success of his venture as much as you might seem to.
I'm not questioning the success if success is measured in obedience.
Sure.
But I am questioning the nobility or the beauty, the attractiveness, the justice of that success. I think the regime that he establishes after conquest is most unattractive.
And you mentioned justice is notably absent basically from the entire book. It's a question of establishing order, not as much probing the just society.
That's interesting. I don't know which issue to take up at the moment, but I would say, and you should disagree with this, but I would say that the book is about justice, and that the simple conversation that he has with his mother about the big coat and the little coat in book 1, chapter 3, at the end of book 1, chapter 3, and you have a big boy who has a little coat and a little boy that has a big coat. Cyrus's teacher says, well, what do you do? And Cyrus says, well, obviously you take the big coat from the little boy and you give it to the big kid, and then the little coat from the big boy and you give it to the little kid, and then each will have what is fitting. Well, I take this as a kind of general discussion about what Cyrus thinks justice is. It's each should have what is fitting. For his answer in a conversation with a Persian elder, he gets beaten. Why? Because that's not what the law says. Each has the coat that they have by the law. But Cyrus is looking, this is my invention, but when I see it, Cyrus is looking at all of society, and he sees the distribution of goods. And what does he think? This is maldistributed. He might even be thinking, my grandfather is a tyrant. He doesn't rule well. He doesn't care about what's right. And he's got all of these possessions. Even in book 1, chapter 6, Cyrus's father is trying to teach him that it's hard to rule. And Cyrus says, it can't be hard to rule. My grandfather does it. My uncle does it. He doesn't mention them by name that way. He just says, starting with those who are closest to us, I can see that rulers are not very clever. They're not very good. So he doesn't have respect for them. So political power is poorly distributed, just like coats can be poorly distributed. So I think he actually is genuinely thinking in the beginning that he can effect a redistribution on some scale of political power and of wealth in accord with norms of justice. And I think that's partly...
And justice is defined as what he sees as fitting.
Is what is fitting.
It's what is fitting.
And I happen to know.
I happen to know, yeah.
That's right. And I think this is that in that speech in 1:5, when he tells the peers, we've been foolish. We've cultivated this virtue and we've never got any rewards for it. I think he thinks it's fitting that we be rewarded for this. So I would see a certain understanding of justice as a motive for for his career. But getting back to what's distasteful at the end, and by the way, I think when you said that everyone was calling him father and had these nice things, my guess is you're citing the passage from the very beginning of the book where it says, Xenophon says, and Cyrus was celebrated in word and song by the barbarians. And I take this to be the way a powerful ruler, a Putin or something, can get himself celebrated because he's very powerful. Just arrange it. So I don't know that that's an honest expression. And
some of it was arranged, right? He had his own men prostrate before, and this kind of got the crowd started in the prostrations, which
very
again,
good. And so this is, and so I find this is part of what I find a bit distasteful. I'll make a quick list. He thinks, I'm now more at risk than I've ever been throughout this entire campaign. Everyone hates me. I need bodyguards. Then you get 2 pages of his reflections on why eunuchs make the best bodyguards. This is, maybe not completely peculiar for Persian emperor, but this is at least a little bit distasteful. It doesn't say where he gets the eunuchs, whether he makes them or finds them, but that's the inner circle of, then that's not enough. Then 10,000 Persian spearmen are brought from old Persia to come and defend him further. That's him. Where is he living now? Not in an army tent along with his men. He's now in the palace in Babylon where all of the wealth has been delivered. He has a conversation with Croesus, one of the defeated generals, and says to Croesus, people haven't seen this, but I crave wealth as much as more as anybody else. I can't get enough of it. open admission of that, the restraint that he's shown has been somewhat false. Then the Persians were the word in Greek is for the peer is equal in honor. They've always been equal in honor, and now they prostrate themselves before Cyrus. The Greek word for prostrate is proskuneo, which means I wish I had the guts to have translated this, do the doggy bow.
Okay.
So this is distasteful, I find, for Persian republicans to do this. And then finally, there's a section in Book 8 that is devoted to how Cyrus treats his friends because he fears them the most, that inner circle that would like to rule as much as he does. And so he tries to sow discord among them so that even if they don't love him, Cyrus, they will hate him less than they hate one another.
But he does say trustworthy friends. This is kind of the scepter of his, the basis of rule when he's giving advice to his children at the end. So for him, friends, would they be friends in an Aristotelian sense? No, they're just be of use, friendship of use.
I think you're right.
Is there anyone who actually arrived in his life that you see that would be a friendship of the good?
I would have thought that Chrysanthus would be a candidate for this, but it doesn't seem that there's anything in the book that is shown where Cyrus seeks out a conversation because he cares about a person. There are very few. I think one of the amazing things about the book is how many speeches are in it. So the battles are surprisingly few. 2 main battles, 2 liberating, 2 takings of cities, 1 minor battle. Total of 10 pages maybe. But the speeches, Cyrus is a major talker, and good. He always sizes up a situation well. But I don't think he has any he doesn't have a confidant, or he doesn't share his inner soul with anybody. He doesn't seem to have a friend in the true sense of the word.
So, okay, a couple things. I'm wondering how much of this is just the reality of empires generally and great leaders generally. You think of a couple things come to mind. One, I think of Charles de Gaulle, who I admire, who was, somewhat similarly kind of aloof, melancholy, didn't have he talks a lot about the profound loneliness and isolation of being a great leader. And, even at one point, one of his soldiers, I think, came in and saw him playing with his daughter who had special needs. And they were just shocked to see sort of a smile, sort of this joy and delight on his face, because they didn't even think he was really capable of it. So there is a sense in which great leaders, often have that lonely kind of journey, and they maybe don't quite they don't feel like they can trust anyone because that is dangerous to their rule. And then secondly, when you're talking about the trappings of his empire, I kind of just provocatively kind of chuckling to myself, thinking of, our own presidency, right? You have the Secret Service, which is kind of this vast network of guards, that the president, everywhere he goes, he's in a full motorcade. He is kind of ensconced in in the White House, which could be considered to be a palace of sorts. It's located in the center of, the wealth and power of the whole nation. When people, when the president goes out and when he walks into a room, everyone stands up, the military salutes. There is a sense in which we could debate to what extent America has perhaps become an empire, right? But there's certain imperial qualities about America, that perhaps don't seem that different from some of the security concerns and the other, strategies that Cyrus himself employed. Is that fair?
I think that's an excellent point, frankly. Yeah. And I just happen to have read about our flying like helicopters inside C-130s or something like that to go to places that our president visits to provide security on the ground. I don't know the details.
Spot network of spies. But, the CIA.
Well, I think this is where I think you're right. But I think you can still, maybe one could say that this network of spies is for the sake of national security and not presidential security only. And Cyrus's method of spying is very interesting. I think it's called The Eyes and the Ears of the King.
Yeah.
And the main point, I believe, is that anyone can be an eye or an ear of the king. All you need to do is to go report. So it's like anyone in the country has a fairly easy access to report a possible crime. And that then is not only, well, it's terrifying because you don't, when you're talking to somebody, you don't know exactly how far you can go. It's more like the KGB. So I think Cyrus may go a little bit further in that department, but I grant
it sows distrust among his subjects.
Exactly. Yeah. I grant your main point, but I also think this other related main point is correct, that rulers, generally speaking, have to do some of these things, not only Cyrus, but I think it's especially that I was led to hope for a little bit more from Cyrus. I'm a little disillusioned, I would say. He seemed more promising, precisely because he did keenly perceive the defects in other forms of government and other rulers. He sees the defects of his uncle, of his grandfather, of the Assyrian king, who's a terrible tyrant, and sees the suffering that he causes to Gadatas and Gobrias. And then in the end, what is the nature of the government that he's established and that he presides over for so long? And this, of course, the final step is taken because the minute he dies, it all falls apart. Because he's given this nice advice to his sons: be nice, be nice, be nice, respect one another. And
it's a beautiful, final word.
But they don't. And for reasons that can be anticipated. I think going way back to you formulated the question earlier, is this corrosive, the kind of moral education of Cyrus? And I think the last chapter of the book suggests that there's been tremendous corrosion, moral corrosion.
So it falls apart right after he dies. Xenophon talks about how men become soft, they no longer revere the gods, kind of their educational standards are lowered, no more piety. And they reap the consequences of that. I'm curious. So obviously, the one reading of it is that Cyrus is to blame. That this shows the corrosive effects of his rule. There's some deformation in his approach to governing. On the flip side, you could say that this is kind of par for the course with great leaders. They somehow kind of, maybe not George Washington, right? Because there's a sense in which what he built has endured, right? And he is kind of he's a builder of one of the greatest nations on earth. And in that sense, he's like Cyrus, but in another sense, he's very different than Cyrus. But how much of this is just simply the fact that kind of great leaders, individuals kind of knit together kind of their body politic in their very being, and that the odds of, I think other people have said that, great men don't often produce great sons. Probably because they're so busy devoted to kind of public life and the affairs, of the state, that they often, I think, neglect their own upbringing of their children. So how much of this is just a function of this is what happens when a great leader dies? No one can really live up to the standard that they set, versus a particular fault of Cyrus's own approach.
Good question. I obviously have inclined up until this point, and so far will continue to incline in the direction of placing some significant share of the blame on Cyrus. I do think that part of Xenophon's goal is to go back to that opening thesis, the passage you read, and say that the problem of rule of human beings over human beings is extremely difficult. And this, I think the education of Cyrus helps to support that thesis and show the difficulty. I wouldn't say it's the real limitations on the part of the sons that are to blame for the breakup of the empire so much as the lack of preparation on Cyrus's part to create a regime that could be independent of personal power, the way Washington did, for example. So for him, everything came back to him, and he decided on everything, and that is great while he's alive. But afterwards, I think you could foresee problems from early on that would ensue upon his demise from that particular way of addressing the problem. I think, I was thinking about just the Persian regime too, and the way that's presented in this education. It only gets really one chapter, 1-2, when at first it looks very attractive to me because of its dedication to the common good and to the cultivation of moral virtue. At least it seems to me that's something that needs to be considered as a political necessity. But then it becomes less attractive when we see that it's an oligarchy, and it's easier to dismiss it. But in the end, I'm thinking that Xenophon probably wants us to compare this regime that Cyrus does corrupt and turn into his empire, or at least his empire surrounds it so that it no longer is politically independent, and what Cyrus creates. And I don't know, but I'm tempted to say Xenophon thinks the rule of law, which he shows to be defective because it doesn't recognize big boys and little boys and big coats and little coats. But that rule of law, for all of its defects, is superior to Cyrus's attempt to have a seeing law, which he gives the fitting of everybody. So I'm tempted, instead of saying that the enthusiasm in this book falls on Cyrus, I'm thinking that it's a moderated, limited enthusiasm for Republican rule of law that is in the end defended by the book.
So it's which is interesting, because in your introduction you say, right, this is really a book about placing, this is kind of the question, is it institutions or is it great individuals? And at the beginning of the book, you talk about how this portrait of Cyrus, it appears at least to be kind of the case for the great individual. Yeah. But you're interesting is that your conclusion, which you think is perhaps Xenophon's conclusion, is that it's really the institutions, the rule of law, that first and foremost lead to an enduring and just regime, not the hopes on the individual.
That's what I'm suggesting. I mean, I do think that Cyrus is a political genius. Yeah. I do think he was attractive. I do think he has intelligent criticisms of the existing state of affairs that he first finds himself in. It's very adroit, but I don't think that what he creates is an adequate response to the problems of politics that run deeper than that.
Sure. And could he have, would it have been possible for him to create something? So his goal was to conquer and to rule an empire, right? Could he have done it any other way? In the sense of, is there a just way that, given the whole trajectory of what it took to take Babylon and ensconce himself as the ruler of all, right? This sort of universal ruler. Is there any world in which you could have seen, in light of the character, in light of his ambitions, in light of who he was, that he could have pivoted in a more just direction so that the end product would have been happier? Or was the cake kind of already baked by the time?
I don't think Xenophon encourages us in that direction. I mean, if I'm just going to use my own imagination, I would say, well, if Churchill were there, he would have created this wonderful regime or something like that. But I think Xenophon more wants to show that Cyrus's project had flaws that were visible to a good reader even early on. And so that one shouldn't be completely surprised, as I was, not being a good reader, but as
the first time you read it.
I'm completely surprised by the conclusion that Cyrus's policies are flawed. But and so I think the question becomes, well, how do you summarize, or what are the lessons about the challenges to solving the political problems in a better way than either Persia solved them or Cyrus solved them, and as understood by Xenophon? I think that's a wonderful and huge new question.
Sure.
But I think part of it is that what is the motive of the political man, and as Xenophon presents Cyrus, he's driven by the love of honor, and that leads him to be very self-controlled, very restrained, not tempted by all sorts of distractions. That's a wonderful benefit of this, but it also leads him to seek power and use that power in ways that enhance his own honor and don't recognize necessarily other goods.
So, why? So there has been a bit of and this is the historical Cyrus, but kind of in a fictional version, there's sort of been a renaissance, a growing popularity around Cyrus today in Iran. Actually, at his tomb, which, it still exists, there's been tens of thousands of people that have gathered there over the past few years. There's something called Cyrus the Great Day, which is an unofficially recognized holiday.
I had no idea.
Yeah, I was shocked. I learned about this just a few weeks ago, actually. And tens of thousands gather. They chant Cyrus's name. They see it as kind of a symbol of resistance to the Iranian regime, and kind of hearkening back to this older Persian tradition. Sure. Anyway, so there might be an opening for people to appreciate Xenophon's education more now. Why should people, especially young people, read this book today? What do you think are those lessons to either emulate or avoid from Cyrus's story?
Yeah. Well, I think in general, they should read it because it's a good introduction to political life on the grand scale. And I think it can cure them of a certain degree of naivete about how easy government is, for example, and show them the vast range of complicated situations that arise. Again, if I were to try to make this case more specific, which I suppose would be required, I would look to Book 1, Chapter 6, 10 pages, as an introduction that would get them thinking about this. But I think that conveys the sort of the Machiavellian character of the book that we talked about. Beyond that, I think it's an experiment in the problems of rule of law, which is, I think, very important for us to consider because it's so easy to point out the defects of the rule of law, as Lincoln had to acknowledge them in the Lyceum speech. That if law can sometimes be accompanied by almost intolerable injustice, but we have to go as far as we possibly can to obey that. Well, why? Because it's just so crucial to hold together a society, which is an enormous challenge. And the education of Cyrus is in part a book of 8 books attacking the rule of law. And so you might say that there's one way of reading it is to see what did Cyrus know that enabled him to successfully attack the rule of law and make himself the master of everything. There's another way of reading the book that would be, what can we learn about how to prevent people like Cyrus from pursuing the career of what does Lincoln say, the tribe of the lion and the eagle and the lion and the Napoleons and Caesars of the world. So I think the book also, by teaching how these men are able to do it, you can prevent also it from prepare yourself from being seduced by them into thinking that they'll represent only good things in the future.
Sure. So those are some maybe lessons, politically speaking. What about for an individual? What do you think they could glean in their own personal life from?
Yeah, that's an excellent question too. And I often wonder, so if one follows my way of reading the book, and there may be good reasons to resist this. Well, there's certainly to resist it, but then I hope you overcome the resistance. But then you say, all right, so Cyrus is not as heroic as he seems. So where does Xenophon point us? Where do I turn if I'm not going to be a Cyrus? I think you have 2 alternatives that Xenophon gives us: himself and Socrates. 2 other peaks, you could say, that are rival peaks to Cyrus. And Xenophon himself as a leader is not like Cyrus. He doesn't seek to establish a despotism over the whole world. He does seek to rule the army such that it is able to make its way back all the way to Byzantium. He is tempted by the possibility of establishing a city which he would rule on the Black Sea, but decides against it. So he's a man who combines political involvement with other interests, and does not give up his whole life for the sake of pursuing the praise of his other fellow creatures.
So he's more Washingtonian in his...
I think you could say that, yeah. And then you've got Socrates.
Yeah.
And that's one heck of a model too, I think. So Xenophon gives us a remarkable portrait of Socrates. And obviously Socrates meant a tremendous amount to Xenophon, maybe everything to Xenophon.
So last question. If you were going to start, if you could, start with reading any book, would it be The Education, or would you start with another work of Xenophon's?
For what audience?
I would say for a college student. Where should someone begin if they want to go deeper in our conversation today?
Well, of course, with thinking of the United States, I've already said nice things about the Federalist Papers, and I think that would be a good option. But when it comes to classical political philosophy, I think The Education of Cyrus is a great place to start. When I think of The Republic by Plato, it's a wonderful book of classical political philosophy, but it's maddeningly difficult in obvious ways. So right on the surface of things, it's hard to figure out what is this divided line or nuptial number, the ideas, and you're drawn immediately into metaphysical concepts that don't have an obvious immediate bearing on your life, perhaps. So, I love The Republic, so don't get me wrong. But I think what's great about the Education of Cyrus is it's really the only work of political philosophy in my mind that's a riveting page turner.
Yeah, it is a page turner.
As well as being profound. And I think if you come to appreciate Xenophon through that book and then look at his Socratic works, I think it will introduce you to, a wonderful and very rich world.
Well, we'll end there. Thanks for joining, Wayne.
It's been a pleasure. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Thanks.